Hi, and welcome to Leap, a podcast series by Startuplifers. The goal here is to have a warm and cozy conversation together with our wonderful alumni who share their life-changing experiences from working at some of the most exciting startups. In the coming episodes, you'll hear real-life stories from those who've made it, how the experience changed their life, and where they are today. Startuplifers is a non-profit organization connecting emerging Nordic talent with the most exciting startup jobs. I'm your host, Pauliina Alanen, and today I have the great pleasure to be here with the Startuplifers alumni, Lauri Hynynen. Lauri has long been active in the Finnish startup scene, having been a key member at Aalto-S, Slush, and Startuplifers teams. Let's hear his story with Startuplifers, how he moved to San Francisco, and where life has taken him since then. Welcome to the show, Lauri.
Awesome. Thanks. Great to be here.
Nice. So let's get right into it then. Tell us a little bit about yourself to get started. Who are you and what do you do now?
Sure. So I'm Lauri Hynynen. Nowadays, I'm leading the product team at a startup called MatchMade. We're building the world's leading influencer marketing platform where like influencers and advertisers can meet each other. So my background is in startups and in the startup scene. So I've been previously working at Slush, one of the early team members at Aalto-ES, and kind of professionally, I'm sort of mixture of business and engineering. So I do write code quite a bit, but then again, my I've studied in the business school.
All right. And just to make sure to our listeners, so Aalto-ES is the Entrepreneurship Society born in Aalto University, where also Startuplifers program is from. Um, so let's go right into your Startuplifers experience that was already some years ago, so in 2013 to 2014. You joined Backlift as their first employee. So you were part of a very small team. And you had an interesting situation while you were living in San Francisco and working there. You ended up steering the company together with the CEO and even go through a pivot. How did you end up in this kind of position with Startuplifers? And how much knowledge about being an entrepreneur did you have before that?
So when I applied to Startuplifers, I had actually founded two companies with my student friends beforehand. So I did have background in startups already back then. Our second startup had ran out of funding, and I was working at Slush back then. And then after Slush was over, a friend of mine working at Startuplifers told me that I definitely should apply. So I sent my application. Uh, Back then, I didn't know that it was like I knew that it was a small company, the one that I was applying to, but I didn't realize that it was like just one person. One person back then. My the CEO Cole hadn't hired anyone before to the company, so actually my first interview task was to actually come up with an interview process or come up with like a homework task for me to do.
Yeah, so Lauri, like you explained, you had been involved with Aalto-ES and the startup scene quite a bit in Finland, even founded two startups or two companies of your own prior to going to San Francisco. But eventually, what made you decide to go with Startuplifers and move to Silicon Valley?
So at the time I was working at Slush and also starting my bachelor's degree at the business school. Uh, I wasn't super excited about that. And then again through Alto years, I had been visiting San Francisco a few times, and then a friend of mine said that yeah, why not apply the start apply first, and I think the primary reason why I ended up applying was that well, why not? So a few years later, here we are.
Yeah, I think it's a common story when a friend recommends Startuplifers and then you just end up sending the application and something happens. at
Indeed.
least at least from what I've heard from other alumni. And actually my own experience as well was quite similar. So, like you said, you had been to SF with Aalto ES and you knew Silicon Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area a little bit already before you moved there. So, how do you think living in San Francisco is different from just visiting it?
I think it's pretty different, and it's probably true for every city you can either visit or live in. I mean, when you're visiting, it's mainly the superficial side of everything. You're sort of tourist. There's so much or so many things to do, uh, but it's still sort of on the superficial level. But then when you actually move in, eventually all the newness sort of wears out, and then you set on for some routines and kind of get to know the place on like deeper level. And of course, I think moving into another country is like a big step for anyone, especially if you haven't done that before. Uh, so I think that's one of the big lessons learned, or like reasons why you should do startup lifers as well. That's kind of getting out of the comfort zone and moving abroad is a great way to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And after you've done it once, you can do it again. It doesn't feel so terrifying anymore.
Indeed.
Yeah, and also in my experience with startup lifers, I had moved already to study abroad prior to that. But then to work is again different because then you get to this new company and you get new colleagues and then you're living this more of an adult life, going to work every day and it's a bit different.
Yeah, I actually haven't done like a study exchange myself, but I could imagine that when you're doing an exchange program, all your friends are they're also doing exchange studies, and there's relatively little contact with the locals. But then when you're working somewhere, most of your friends will be people who also just live there.
Yeah, exactly. So let's go a little bit back to Backlift and the time when you were living and working in San Francisco. So, like we discussed, you ended up as sort of a co founder to the new company that you joined. And you even had to steer the company through a pivot. How long did you end up staying in San Francisco in total?
I stayed there for about a year, plus or minus a week or so.
All right. So during that time, were you just two people in the company all the time, or did you hire more?
Most of the time, it was just the two of us. So for a few months, we hired a third person, a marketing intern, to help us with all the marketing related stuff. But most of the time, it was just the two of us.
Yeah, okay. That's a bit of a different experience than others have had with startup lifers.
Yeah,
Usually you don't join companies that are that young. Do you know how this person found about startup lifers?
I don't know for sure, but Cole was an alumni of Y Combinator, this startup accelerator in Silicon Valley, and Startup Lifers team had reached out to all the companies in the accelerator, and then for some reason Cole picked that up and sent an email to the Startup Lifers team that yeah he could be interested in hiring an intern.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But it was also very lucky of him to get somebody with your extensive experience with already two startups founded when you joined. But then when you got back to Finland after this experience at Backlift, uh, did you have to then switch jobs? Like you couldn't continue to backlift anymore? And what did you end up doing then once you got back?
So I was considering that I would continue working on Backlift remotely, but then ultimately I ended up switching jobs. So there was this new startup called Smartly.io, and I knew the founders there, so I reached out to Krista to ask if they are still or were still hiring. So yeah, then I moved back to Finland and started at Smartly.
Yeah, and didn't you end up opening Smartly's San Francisco office during your time there?
That's true. Yeah. So around 2 years later, after moving back to Finland, I moved back or started spending more time in the States while opening the Smartly business there.
Yeah, very cool. And then if we come closer to today, in 2017, you founded again your own company, Prompter AI. How did your experience in San Francisco affect this decision to again found your own company, and did it change things for you?
I think it definitely helped. I mean, of course, I had founded companies before, so there wasn't, in a sense, anything new about that for me. And it was also a few years after my previous San Francisco visit, but definitely having the lifers experience helped there. I think so. Startup wise, what it gives you is just a lot of perspective. In that it's not a startup working only in Finland, building products for 5 million people in here. But on one hand, that you're competing with the startups in San Francisco or in Silicon Valley, but also that you can actually compete with them and you can build global businesses, and that should be the goal.
Yeah, exactly. So tell me about things related to entrepreneurship and startups beyond what you just explained that you think you hadn't learned unless you'd gone to the States.
I think it boils down to just the level of ambition and kind of the mindset that since day one we were building like a global company, and not aiming to be like a small scale local business, but building $1 billion company since day one. I think one lesson learned that has stuck with me since Startuplifers was when we were raising funding for Backlift, and so I was fairly involved in that process as well. But we were talking with one investor who explained that yeah, they could see our company becoming like 100 million business or 10 million in annual revenue, but that they weren't really in the business of investing in lifestyle businesses. And I was like, wow, you think 100 million company is a lifestyle business? To me, that would be pretty huge. But no, I mean, for them 100 million is a small lifestyle business, and then when you get to the scale of 1 billion, then that starts to become interesting. And we talked quite extensively about this rule of thumb that for 1 billion you need to have 100 million of annual revenue, and then like how does that revenue build up, whether it's like 100 customers paying 1 million a year, or a million customers paying $100 a year. But like how does that 100 million build up? And I think that still affects a lot of my thinking. For example, for Prompter, we spent quite a bit of time thinking that, okay, how does the math work, and how do we get to that 1 billion?
Yeah, that sounds like a very useful and pragmatic lesson about like exactly the importance of math and how even at the very early stage of the company you need to you need to have a solid roadmap and idea of how to get there, especially when you're talking with investors.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's not even about like some kind of exact plan on how to get there, but more about just the mindset that the goal is to build $1 billion business, and like thinking things on that scale since day one. I think that's super important. And of course, you can read all of this from blogs or uh, this podcast, but it's a whole lot different to read about it from somewhere or then actually be there and experience it firsthand.
Yeah, exactly. Learn by doing. So sounds like you had a very valuable experience in San Francisco. How was it to actually work there for you?
For me, it was pretty intense. I mean, we were just two people working on the company, so the days were fairly long. Occasional weekends as well, but also no one really forced me to work long hours. It was more about just being passionate about the product we were building, so that came pretty naturally. But also, that being said, I think for most people in the startup lifers, it wasn't that intense. No working on weekends and things like that. I think that was like a specific feature of our company, uh, in that we were both like super small company, but also that was just the way we like to do things.
Yeah, and I realize we haven't really discussed what was Backlift's core product. So you mentioned lifestyle business, but could you tell us a little bit more about what you were actually trying to build together with your co-founder Cole?
So Backlift was this website hosting platform where you could write HTML files, CSS, JavaScript, the tools that the designers usually know. You could write those, and then the files would be in your Dropbox folder. But then from Dropbox, it would actually automatically sync to the live internet. So you could edit the files in Dropbox, and the website would be built automatically. And the idea was that there's a bunch of designers and people who don't want to be limited by these visual website builders, but want to like actually write or build a custom website, but then don't want to bother with things like command line tools and all the engineering stuff it takes to actually publish the website. But it would be just files on your computer in Dropbox, and then the website would go live automatically.
Okay, sounds like the first evolution of kind of what we today have a lot like Webflow or Squarespace or
Yeah, the eventually the company was actually acquired by Squarespace,
oh,
and definitely we were as for most companies, we were too early in the market. But since then, Webflow has made or solved a lot of the same problems that we solved. Or then there's this other company called Netlify, which is doing
yeah.
very similar things than what we were doing back then.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, it's already been some time since that your experience in San Francisco. So it's interesting how that technology and the idea that you had has evolved since then.
Yeah.
Uh, so if we go back to sort of the big picture here and try to sum up a little bit some of the biggest learnings that you had from that year that you spent in California, and also since then kind of going back and forth first with Smartly and then with Prompter AI, your own company. What are some of the biggest learnings that you could sum up for us here?
So on top of all the technical stuff that I learned about whether it's fundraising or building products or technology, or things like that. The two biggest lessons learned are probably on one hand, the as mentioned, the level of ambition, kind of seeing how the startups are built in Silicon Valley, that it's not like being global companies since day one and thinking in terms of the 1 billion scale. That's a big thing. And also realizing that in every other way they are not any different companies. It's like the only thing setting them apart is the level of ambition and not being restricted into just being a small businesses. So knowing that since I can I can play in their league, and there's really nothing preventing me from building the next Facebook or the next Google. Just need to set the ambition level high enough. That's one big lesson learned, and another one is I think it's the moving abroad thing, and just challenging oneself, going out of the comfort zone. So when I applied, or when I moved in, I was of course a little worried that how is everything gonna go? Am I just are they expecting way more of me than what I actually can do, or what if I just mess up everything? Uh, and turns out everything worked fine. It builds up this how hard can it be mindset, and makes facing new challenges more comfortable. So for example, then when I moved back to San Francisco with Smartly, I could focus more on the business side of things and worry less about how everything is gonna go with regards to moving part.
Yeah, I think that's very nicely summed up. So, Lauri, since you have been in the early days of Aalto, yes, and then uh, a long time member of Slush team and the Slush community as well, and in general, important player in this startup scene in Finland. Also, I would like to hear a bit about how you experienced the Startuplifers community in San Francisco when you were there.
in in short, I think it was awesome. So one I mentioned earlier that when doing exchange studies, most of your friends are probably other exchange students, whereas then in startup lifers, most of your friends are people working in the city and sort of local. But that's not entirely true, because of in San Francisco there is and was a big startup lifers community as well, like other startup lifers, which definitely made, for example, moving there a lot easier. And yeah, kind of a safety net, if you will, in that no need to start from zero, but there's friends you can hang out with, and friends who can give you tips on what kind of cell phone plan to get, or where to find apartment, and so on. So definitely having the startup lifers community helped there, and helps also afterwards. So still there's a bunch of like friends I made during startup lifers that still hang out with. Probably sometime in the future, either I end up hiring them or they end up hiring me, and it's a really good community that is not only present at the during the startup lifers year, but afterwards as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember when I was living in San Francisco in 2017 to 2018, I think you were already with Prompter AI at the time, but then you just suddenly appeared to San Francisco to one of your trips that you were just spending like 1 or 2 months there or a few weeks, and then the whole kind of just random people from the community gathered for like beers or something after work.
Yeah, indeed. I I remember those trips as well.
Okay, so I think we're approaching the end of our podcast here. So if you, Lauri, would now talk to a person who is kind of thinking about perhaps moving to San Francisco and getting a job there with Startuplifers, uh, what are the things that you would say to this person about what they could learn and why they should really go for it and just apply?
So the two biggest things you learn there is on one hand, there's of course all the work related skills and improving yourself professionally, but also then as mentioned, there's the mindset and the mindset level stuff. On one hand, about moving abroad and kind of getting perspective to things, but also just experiencing the uh, Silicon Valley startup scene, and startup scene or the tech scene. I think is super fun and interesting. So in a way, if someone's considering applying, then my question would be that why not? Like, what's the what's the worst that could happen? Uh, so yeah, definitely, I would just recommend everyone to apply. Or, for example, if considering exchange studies, then thinking about lifers as an alternative for that.
Yeah, exactly. Or then doing both.
that
Also
that
studying
as
and
well.
working. Studying and working abroad.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely agree with you on that. But thank you, Lauri, for joining us today and for sharing your story with Backlift and your kind of unique experience of becoming the co-founder or first employee of Backlift in 2013 to 2014. That's it for Leap. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Lauri, for joining us this time. To hear more stories from Startuplifers alumni and their life-changing experiences at some of the most exciting startups in the world, catch the new Leap episodes released on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're interested in applying for a startup job, go to startuplifers.org and check out the open positions, or simply get in touch with the Startuplifers team. Until next time.